It was a tempestuous weekend in Japan. Typhoon Hagibis flexed its muscles and cancelled all Saturday activities. With the rain came hope for Mercedes, since they were comprehensively the quickest during Friday practice. But this hope died as the heavens cleared, and before you know it, it was Ferrari lining up first and second on the grid. Their despair was compounded as the Japanese lady went about butchering the Japanese national anthem. I suspect Vettel was so distracted by trying to stop his ears from bleeding that he jumped the start by accident. Hello and welcome to the TF1 Show's recap of the Japanese Grand Prix. I'm your host, Tinas Ferreira, the sandbags that prevents the flooding from the typhoon Hagibis that is the world of F1. And let me tell you that it is a miracle that I still have the complete faculty of speech, since it was a pretty early morning here close to the Greenwich Meridian. But getting up at 3 a.m. was but the smallest sacrifice to ensure that everyone there in Japan was safe, and I think we can applaud the FIA, FOM and race control for the very professional and efficient way that they dealt with the logistical difficulties. So let's jump straight into the recap and talk about Mercedes. Now, it was another race victory for the Silver Arrows, and our old boy Valtteri Bottas is back on the top step. How exciting. It's been a long time since everybody was getting weak-kneed and teary-eyed at Bottas' new beard and his love for porridge. And this was his first race win since Baku, which incidentally was the fourth race of the season. So it's been a long time coming. I think you can see he was pretty pleased with himself and with the team after the race. And I guess it's a nice reward after all of the assistance he's been doing and he's been giving to Mercedes and Hamilton throughout the season. And, he is still technically in the championship fight, so I think he's now lasted longer this year than what he lasted last year. So I guess that at least shows some improvement from his side in terms of the Drivers' Championship. But I think in terms of Mercedes' performance in general over the weekend, we have to say that qualifying was a difficult affair once again. Their high drag design philosophy coupled with Ferrari's engine advantage over one lap meant that they are now constantly and consistently second best in qualifying, and I think this will definitely be a concern for them when going into 2020. And the slightly worrying thing for them is I don't really see how this will be a quick fix for them, other than making some major breakthroughs in terms of their engine and in terms of their energy or electricity deployment in the actual power unit. But there was still some glimmers of hope, as Mercedes' race pace was still very much on form. They had a distinct advantage over both Ferrari and Red Bull during the race, and Sebastian Vettel actually afterwards in his interviews commented that, despite all of their difficulties today, and I'll get to that a bit later, he still thinks it would have been very difficult for them to actually keep the Mercedes behind, given that it turned out to be a two-stop race, which effectively gave Mercedes double the opportunity to potentially undercut or play with the strategy and overtake Ferrari in that way. But, that's the way the cookie crumbled for them and for Mercedes, and Bottas took advantage of Ferrari's difficult start, and he was leading by the second corner. And I'll obviously discuss Ferrari's misfortunes a bit later, as I just mentioned. But I think what was interesting today from Mercedes' perspective, now obviously, as I just said, Bottas was ahead by the second corner, and Hamilton, I think, remained in fourth place in the position that he qualified in. Now, as the race developed, Mercedes decided to put them on a split strategy where effectively they covered Sebastian Vettel putting early on, and effectively Sebastian Vettel then going onto a two-stop strategy. Mercedes used Valtteri Bottas to cover that and then also put him the next lap, which then effectively meant, given the amount of laps he still had to do at that point in time, Bottas was guaranteed to do a two-stop strategy. But Mercedes decided to keep Lewis Hamilton out for quite a few laps longer to see if they can't make a one-stop strategy work for them. Now, I thought this was a very interesting decision by Mercedes. I actually thought that Bottas would lose the race win because of this decision, because I think initially people thought, and before the race, Pirelli said that the quickest strategy they suspect will be a one-stop. And when obviously Hamilton moved on to a one-stop, I thought Mercedes has once again thrown Bottas under the bus, and that Hamilton will be able to eke out his tyre life given his ability to conserve his tyres usually in the race and then take the race victory. But, it turned out to not be the case. Hamilton was actually quite upset because Bottas drove a very good opening couple of laps after his first pit stop and effectively caught up with Hamilton before he even made his first pit stop, which then meant Hamilton was 20 odd seconds behind Bottas when he came out of the pits after his first stop. Now, I still thought, given that Hamilton was then catching Bottas over the course of the second stint, that if Bottas had to pit again, Hamilton might still have the pace to actually stay ahead of both him and Vettel. And I still think he would have been able to do it, especially given the fact that, so if they kept Hamilton out, he was effectively only racing Bottas and Vettel because Albon in fourth place was way behind. I think he was more than a pit stop behind in any case. So if I was Mercedes, and this is just the complete pragmatic sort of view, third was the worst that Hamilton would have ended up with, if you think about it. So why didn't they just leave Hamilton out, see if he can't hold on until the end of the race, at least see if he can't cover Vettel, even if he lets Bottas through and then tries to stay ahead of Vettel, given how important track position is at the Japanese Grand Prix, at the Suzuka track. So I was surprised that they actually decided to pit Hamilton for the second time and then asked him to effectively try and overtake Vettel with his incredible straight line speed in his Ferrari on track. Because I think it was always going to be a tall order. Doesn't matter how good his new tyres are, just because of how fast the Ferrari is on the straight and because of the limited overtaking opportunities you do have on the Suzuka track. So for Mercedes came out and said that they knew there was no way that Hamilton's tyres would have lasted up until the end. But then why didn't you just keep him out and then still pit him and put him on fresh tyres if the tyres fell off the cliff? He would have still ended up in third place, which was the result that he got at the end of the day anyways. So that was a bit of a confusing one for me. But in any case, Hamilton did get the fastest lap as well. So that then effectively meant that with Bottas winning the race and Hamilton coming third and getting that point for the fastest lap, that meant that Mercedes became 6-time consecutive double world champions. And that's quite a mouthful. So let me explain. So they are effectively the first team in history to win both the Constructors and the Drivers' Championship for 6 consecutive years, which is an incredible achievement if you think about it. Given that they, with their points haul, they tied up the Constructors, so they won the Constructors' Championship, and then also the result ensured that only Hamilton or Bottas can still mathematically win the Drivers' Championship. So even though the Drivers' Championship isn't yet completely decided, only a Mercedes driver can mathematically win. So that then means that Mercedes has achieved this incredible feat. And I think it is a complete testament of how good this team is. If you think about the fact that they have now won these championships across 2 major aerodynamic regulation changes, the 2014 to 16 years was a specific design, and there was a massive overhaul with these new sort of longer, flatter, wider cars that they dominated as well. And then this year with the much more simplified front wing and the lower rear wing, or the higher rear wing, it's just an incredible and amazing achievement that they have managed in terms of how they were able to stay so dominant across different rules, different drivers, different types of opposition, different challenges. And they're just so good operationally and strategically, and they're just so consistent, and they're basically bulletproof in terms of reliability. And I think what the really, really amazing thing about this team is how they are able to bounce back from setbacks and how they're able to learn from mistakes. it's very rare, and I'm really struggling to think of an example where they made the same mistake twice. So yes, they do make mistakes, and they have made mistakes over the past 6 years, but they always learn from them, and you never see them making that same mistake again. So I think they're just probably they're going to have a real fight on their hands, I think, next year with Ferrari on the up. And you never know with Red Bull, maybe they find some silver bullet and Adrian Newey finds some aerodynamic loophole that they can exploit, but I somehow doubt it, given that the regulations will basically remain the same for next year. But I won't bet against this Mercedes team still coming out on top. Just how they can problem solve and come up with solutions. And we've seen this time and time again especially over the last 2 to 3 years, whenever they're behind, and there were times where they were not the fastest car, they somehow found a way to develop that car and to still, bring it back into the window where they can win races and then consequently championships. But for now, we must just celebrate one of the greatest achievements in F1 history and applaud Mercedes for, I think, now definitely being one of the best teams that the sport has ever seen. And I think that's the perfect segue into one of the other best teams that the sport has ever seen, in the form of Ferrari, who were beautiful swans in qualifying, who turned into ugly ducklings in the race, with Vettel jumping the start, messing up his actual start, Leclerc getting away slowly, both getting passed by Bottas, Leclerc getting passed by Verstappen, Leclerc crashing into Verstappen, Leclerc breaking his front wing, Leclerc refusing to pit with bits of his broken front wing dragging along the racetrack, and then they started the second lap of the race. Now, all joking aside, this was a bit of a shambles day for Ferrari that started so incredibly well, and I think we can now say they are the de facto best car in qualifying especially. Now, the skeptic in me kept finding reasons after the Singapore and the Sochi Grand Prix as to, why the tracks were hiding Ferrari's fundamental weaknesses, and I was fully prepared to see Suzuka expose their car for the fraud that I thought it was. And, I actually felt vindicated after Friday practice. They had poor one-lap pace and they had shocking long-run pace. I mean, they were so bad over the race distance on Friday. I was like, yeah, you see... Sochi and Singapore were just tracks that were actually in Ferrari's wheelhouse, and now the Suzuka track with its long radius corners is now finally again exposing Ferrari's limitations. But this morning at 3 a.m. I was forced to eat a decent helping of humble pie, because their engine is now such a nuclear bomb that it can nullify any corner deficit that the car still has. And I do think the upgrade package, it does seem to now help them minimize their loss to Mercedes and Red Bull in the corners, and they just drive off into the distance on the straights. So there's not much, and I think sort of Mercedes said this after qualifying, they don't know what to do about this. They say they're going to have to go and look and try and investigate how they can improve what's been quite a distressing qualifying performance from them against the Ferrari cars. Not even to talk about Red Bull, I'll get to them a bit later, but I mean, Ferrari and now this weekend in the hands of Sebastian Vettel, they are a formidable package over one lap, and I'm struggling to see how that's going to change given the tracks that are still coming up. Maybe Brazil is going to be difficult for them potentially. Mexico maybe will nullify a bit of the engine advantage that they have given the low density air and the high altitude. But yeah, I think Ferrari is definitely the car to beat over one lap. And I think we do have to give a round of applause to Sebastian Vettel for his best qualifying performance, I think, since the Canadian Grand Prix, where he did properly, comprehensively beat his teammate and he beat everybody else with, I think both of his laps in Q3 was good enough for pole position. So that should tell you everything you need to know. And I think that will be a very welcome boost for Sebastian Vettel after losing the qualifying battle to his teammate comprehensively ever since they came back from the summer break. And, Charles Leclerc, he was slightly off colour this weekend, and I'll get into his race a bit later, but he just struggled compared to Vettel, and he admitted as much. He said he just couldn't get the car where he wanted. He struggled with his driving, and he admitted that Vettel was too good on the day. and that he took his defeat like a man, which I thought was good to see. And I also think that the two drivers seem to have kissed and made up. I think they seem to have a pretty good and decent relationship. They were quite amicable towards each other, both after qualifying and after the race. But I do think, when the real prizes are on the line, so in other words, next year, I think we will see fireworks once more when the stakes are high, because I don't think the stakes are high for them anymore, given that they are both now officially out of the Drivers' Championship and out of the Constructors' Championship. Okay, now let's talk about this disaster of a race that Ferrari had. And let's maybe start with Vettel's jump start, or Vettel jumping the start. So if you watched the race this morning, he effectively hesitated, wanted to pull away, and then realized he was going too soon, stopped, and then as soon as the lights went off, he then pulled away and continued on his merry way, or, well, not that merry way, I guess. But obviously now, him realizing that he pulled away too quickly then meant that he wasn't ready for the actual start of the race, which then led to his actual start being a poor one. But and I actually, while watching this race and watching sort of the aftermath of Vettel's start, was very confused as to why he wasn't being penalized for a quite obvious infringement. And it was my understanding from the rules that if you can see with the naked eye that you are effectively starting before you were supposed to, that should be, I think, a drive-through penalty. I think that's what Raikkonen got earlier in the year. But then they came out and said that no, there's a tolerance within the rules, and I went to go check, and that's actually the case. There's a tolerance as to how much the car can actually jump the start. And then this is similar to what happened to Valtteri Bottas last year in Austria, where Bottas also jumped the start, but he jumped it in such a minimal way that it didn't actually make a big difference. And I think we can all see that Vettel did not gain any advantage from his jump start. So I guess we can't be too, or nobody can be too sore about him not getting a penalty there. Although I guess if he was a few millimeters more rambunctious, he might have actually gotten a penalty there, which would have just added insult to injury for Ferrari, given what happened to his teammates at the start. So as I mentioned earlier, Leclerc also ended up getting quite a poor start, and then he got overtaken by Max Verstappen around the outside into the first corner, and then he ran wide. So he basically ran wide into Verstappen on the outside, ruining Verstappen's race effectively, and then breaking his front wing. Now, Leclerc claimed afterwards and that he had understeer, or due to the fact that Vettel was in front of him, which then meant that he was in the dirty air of Sebastian Vettel, and then with his colder tires and the aerodynamic disturbances in front of him, he just got understeer and he was effectively a sitting duck that understeered into Max Verstappen. But then Max Verstappen argued and said, listen, you are a Formula One driver driving for one of the top teams. You should know that if you are stuck behind another car, that you will have some limitations with regard to your handling, and you should have been able to allow for this. And after the race, interestingly, initially the stewards said, no, this is just a racing incident and they're not going to investigate it further. And then a few minutes later, they came back and said, actually, no, wait, we are going to investigate this. And then they went about investigating it. And then a half an hour later, they said, actually, no, this is just too overwhelming for us. We need to investigate this after the race. Now, I think that's stupid, because it's not that difficult of an incident to review. I would have imagined they would have had all the telemetry available to them in real time. And they argued that they wanted to speak to the drivers. But what will the drivers tell them that the telemetry wouldn't have told them already? And I think this thing that the FIA is doing, or the stewards are doing, where they want to wait until the end of the race to investigate, I think, in specific cases I get it. But I think in some cases it's a bit of a cop-out to not upset people during the race too much, and so that they don't appear to be influencing the race result in real time as much. And I think that's silly, because unfortunately I think Leclerc was at fault here, and the 5-second penalty that he ended up getting was justified by the stewards. But in any case, I digress. They did penalize him at the end. I just think it was silly for them to decide to defer this to the end of the race or to after the race. Now, what this crash had as a side effect, if you can call it that, was Leclerc then suffered with a broken front wing, with the one end plate just dragging along the track surface after the incident. And then, he was driving along and Leclerc came on the radio and said, the car actually feels fine. He realizes that there might be some damage, but his car is still going very nicely. I don't know what that says about the Ferrari front wing and the amount of impact the front wing has on the aerodynamics. If, with a completely broken front wing end plate, the car basically feels no different, but I digress. Yeah, so he claimed the car felt fine and that he can just continue on his merry way with this massive wing and this carbon fiber bits just dragging along the racetrack. Now, what Leclerc didn't realize, and he did say this after the race, that he obviously from his perspective couldn't see the extent of the damage. So he didn't realize how big of a chunk of his wing was actually broken and it was dragging on the floor. And then obviously this is a slightly dangerous situation, as we then saw a lap or two later where that piece of carbon fiber broke off the wing and then effectively almost flew into Lewis Hamilton's face. And it broke off Hamilton's side mirror as he was following Leclerc closely just behind him. And that, I feel, is quite dangerous. And I feel it is unacceptable for Ferrari, firstly, and for the FIA for not acting in a bit more of a proactive way. Because so now afterwards, it all came to light that the FIA told Ferrari to call Leclerc in, and the Ferrari then said that they were going to, and then Leclerc said no, the car feels fine, and then Ferrari didn't call him in, and then Leclerc did another lap, and then the front wing fell off, and then the FIA said, okay, why didn't you call him in? And then Ferrari basically told Leclerc to come in. And I just feel that extra lap or two that he did was irresponsible, and they should have been basically a lot more forceful with Leclerc, and they should have told him to just come in immediately, given that he obviously would not have seen the extent of the damage that his front wing has. And I think they were also again punished appropriately for that, given that he then got another 10-second penalty, him and Ferrari. I think the FIA effectively then placed the blame on Ferrari themselves for not making sure that Leclerc came in quickly enough. But he got another 10-second penalty, and then that then meant that Charles Leclerc was relegated to 7th place. Now, before all of this happened, it was actually very entertaining to watch Charles Leclerc slice and dice his way through the midfield after making his early pit stop and getting his wing changed. I mean, he pulled off some really, really nice overtaking moves, and I think he just showed once again that he's quite the racer, and he can make an overtake if the need be, and he is quite creative as well in where he overtakes. Like he doesn't wait for the long straight and the chicane to do it. He overtook quite a few times into the spoon curve. He overtook Kimi Raikkonen in 130R, which is, I thought, a very, very impressive overtake on the inside. So, I think he did show his pedigree during the race, but he also, Leclerc showed his immaturity, I think, as well. And it is to be expected. He is a 21-year-old in a leading car, and Verstappen has had a couple of years to sort of iron out some of those kinks, if you can call it that. So, expect Leclerc to learn from this and to be a bit more maybe conscious of what he's doing when he is racing hard with competitors, and then also in terms of thinking about what his loose body parts might do to his competitors on the track. Now, I think Ferrari will be pretty pleased with the overall pace in qualifying especially, but they did still have some difficulties with race pace, and especially with tire degradation, where they weren't as quick as the Mercedes during the race, which is, I guess, it's been a recurring theme, except maybe for Russia. But usually their straight line speed advantage is so big, it actually doesn't matter, because the cars just can't get past them. Doesn't matter how quick they are through the corners. And I think if they had both of the cars up front, 1 and 2, it would have been a similar situation. Maybe with the 2 pit stops, Mercedes would have been able to engineer a bit of an undercut, but you'll never know. But I think if there's a weakness for Ferrari, it's definitely going to be the tyre degradation and their race pace going into next year that they're going to have to address. Somehow figure out a way to get more mechanical grip out of their car and to make sure that the car doesn't slide as much through the corners, which effectively leads to the overheating and the degradation of the tyres. Alrighty, let's talk about Red Bull. It's been enough about Ferrari. I've been, so much of my airtime over the past 3 to 4 weeks has been dedicated to the Scuderia. So let's move along swiftly to Red Bull. Now, I think they were probably the big losers of this weekend. And the timing, quite frankly, sucked for them because they took strategic engine penalties in previous races to ensure that they all have the most powerful Spec 4 engine available in front of their Honda fans at home, and they brought a fancy new fuel that they expected to transform their cars into a straight munching machine. And the tail of the tape was that they ended up qualifying in 4th and 5th, and not 4th and 5th, 5th and 6th, and a lonely 4th for Albon in the race. Now let's maybe talk about Albon firstly, because I was very, very impressed with him during the race and especially during qualifying, and I think he seems to be more comfortable in the car this race weekend, which is encouraging after his struggles in Russia 2 weeks ago, where he basically only looked like himself, or he looked like a Red Bull driver on the Sunday, where he struggled a lot during free practice in Russia. So it was nice to see Albon on the pace straight out of the box on Friday, and then obviously this morning in qualifying he matched Max Verstappen in qualifying to the decimal. Basically, they did exactly the same lap time, with then Max getting the 5th place in qualifying because he set the lap first. I don't understand why that is the tiebreaker, but in any case, no matter. And I think this is quite an impressive achievement from Albon, just because Max Verstappen has always gone well at Suzuka, and it's a track that he's very good at. And if you keep in mind that this is still a new car that Albon is learning, and this is the first time he's ever driven at Suzuka this weekend, I think it shows that Albon can hang with the big boys on his day. And it's hopefully a big encouragement for Red Bull going forward. And I think if I think about Albon, there are, and sort of his performance over the whole weekend, there are 2 things about him that give me hope, and which tell me that he can become a very good F1 driver. Now, the first thing is that he will go for the overtake, and we've seen this a couple of times where he started at the back due to an engine penalty, or even, in Russia where he had his accident in qualifying. He makes those overtakes. He will go for an overtake. He will go late on the brakes. He mugged Lando Norris in the hairpin. He was slightly ambitious, I have to say, but I think he did quite a good version of the Daniel Ricciardo late lunge on the brakes. He wasn't quite able to do that with Sainz, but he said his tires were dead at that point after following Norris for a couple of laps. But I think in general, you can see that Alex Albon won't just sit behind a car that's difficult to overtake, that he will go and take the chance. Now, whether that's always going to pay off remains to be seen, but I do think if you want to drive for a top team, sometimes you're going to have to bite the bullet, and as Daniel Ricciardo says, lick the stamp and send it. Now, the second thing that I think is very encouraging about Albon is that he wasn't satisfied after the race. He was actually quite pragmatic, and he highlighted the fact that he wanted to be closer to the top 3, and that he got the poor start, which then relegated him behind the 2 McLarens at the beginning. And he then effectively said that, the outcome actually was quite good for him, but he thought he could have done a lot better and actually challenged the front runners. And I think, again, that's the attitude that one of these drivers needs to have. It would have been very easy for him to say, he came 4th, he was best of the rest, he did his job, and be done with it. But the fact that he was not satisfied and that he came out publicly and said it, I think is a very encouraging thing for Alex Albon. So a very good job this weekend, and I hope he can build on this over the remainder of the season. Now let's talk about old Max. Now, he's been having a difficult second half of the season ever since we came back from the summer break. It's been a bit of a rough going for Max, obviously due to varying factors. So obviously he had the aforementioned grid penalties due to the engine changes. They had a bit of a form issue in Singapore. He had another grid penalty in Russia. So it's been slim pickings for Verstappen, I think. And even more surprisingly, Albon has actually outscored him since he joined the team after the summer break, which also I think Max would not enjoy at all. Now, the crash obviously with Charles Leclerc was not Max's fault, and he actually got a good start, which is very contrary to what we've been seeing from Red Bull this year so far. But who knows how the race could have turned out if things went a bit differently, if him and Charles didn't collide at the start. You never know. Max could have been, in amongst the top three there and have maybe pushed very hard for a good podium position. But, you never know. And it's all hypotheticals, I guess, up now at this point. But I think we can conclusively say that Red Bull was still the third best car this weekend, despite them going out of their way to somehow get everything and get the maximum out of the engine. They still had the third best car, and obviously due to some engine difficulties, just they don't have an engine as powerful as Mercedes and especially as Ferrari. But also they're not winning through the corners anymore as well. Mercedes is, I think, they're equal, if not they're superior in through the corners. So there's no specific area where Red Bull is the gold standard anymore, and I think that's exactly what their problem is. Where in the past they always knew that Mercedes and Ferrari might have the engine advantage, but at least they can pull back some of the time in the twisty bits. But this year, and especially later on in the season, it doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And you can actually see that Red Bull, and especially Helmut Marko, they're getting a bit nervous about Verstappen jumping ship at the end of 2020, because you can just see them making some comments sort of saying, no, they're sure Honda's engine will be on par with Mercedes and everybody else's by next year, and that they are, very hopeful about their package for 2020. And so far, unfortunately, it's been slightly empty promises, because I don't see that package coming together as quickly as they would want it to be able to confidently say that they will keep Max. But then on the other side of the coin, where will Verstappen end up going if he decides to leave Red Bull? Ferrari, I don't think you'll get any joy. It's Leclerc's team, it's Vettel's team, and if Vettel leaves at the end of next year, Mick Schumacher, there are so many other options that they'll potentially put in that car that I don't think, also given Leclerc and Verstappen's history, as we saw again today, I don't think that'll be a harmonious working relationship. So I don't really think there's room for Verstappen at Ferrari. And at Mercedes, there might be a spot if they do decide to not keep on Bottas, or if they decide to not promote George Russell into the big team. But all hypotheticals, I guess, at this point. Just, I think Red Bull, they're going to start getting a bit more nervous as the deadline for Verstappen's contract renewal gets closer. Now, I think just as a final thought for Red Bull, I think they will hope that they can be back at a track that they have dominated in the past, which is Mexico. So they love the Mexico circuit. It's been a track that's been very kind to their car. But then again, we've said that about Singapore this year as well, and look how that turned out for them. So I do hope that Red Bull can be in the thick of things again, or in the mix at least. So yeah, let's see in 2 weeks' time. And now we can turn our thoughts to the midfield, and let's start with McLaren and the little engine that could, Carlos Sainz. He was once again out and out my driver of the day for this race. And if you follow me on Twitter, you would have seen me gush endlessly this morning, just about how highly I rated his performance and how impressive I thought he was. And I'm just so impressed with his consistency and his race pace, and he doesn't make mistakes, and he just executes so well day in, day out. And we've said this so many times this year already, and we're saying it again, and I'm just running out of superlatives for how well he's done. And I do still think and believe that he does not get the amount of credit and hype that he deserves, because I think there's a case to be made that along with Hamilton and Verstappen and Leclerc of late, that Sainz has been one of the best drivers this entire year. And how bigger teams aren't looking to snap him up, I don't understand, because he seems to be doing such an excellent job. Now, his teammate Lando Norris also had, I think, an excellent start, at least, and he qualified quite well. But he was one of the hapless victims of Charles Leclerc's front wing debris. One of his brake ducts got clogged up, and then he was about to go into the pits, and then he got mugged by Albon with his late braking attempt in the hairpin, and that effectively cooked Norris's goose, because then he had to go into the pits, and then he had damage to, I think, his side pods and to his barge boards, and that obviously then hampered his performance slightly. But I think we do, again, just need to applaud McLaren and how they've come along this year and how they've been able to, keep on developing their car, keep on improving. They have a brilliant driver lineup, and I'm very hopeful for them going into next year. And I think Sainz mentioned that it was so nice for him to actually be able to match Albon and Leclerc's pace in the second half of the race. And I think that is a testament to how good the McLaren car is now getting, and also to how good Sainz was driving, because I think he was literally lapping a second a lap faster than the rest of the midfield at that point, which is crazy to think about, and very much a gold star I would give Carlos Sainz for his day at the Japanese Grand Prix. Now let's talk about their biggest rivals, which was Renault, and Renault had a horrible qualifying. They had reliability issues on both cars, with Ricciardo having some suspension issues. Hulkenberg had a hydraulics problem. I think they qualified in 17th and in 16th, or 16th and 15th, or I'm not sure, but way down the order. And I have to say they had an excellent recovery in the race. Both of them ended up in the points, especially Daniel Ricciardo had a very good race. He also made some good overtakes. We actually didn't see a lot of him on the world feed, but yeah, I think he did a very good job to score some good points for Renault. But now it actually came out after the race, and this could be a potential disaster for Renault on the horizon. So Team Racing Point submitted like a 12-page document to the FIA and to the stewards that basically accuses Renault of having automatic brake bias adjustments throughout the race, which could be seen as a driving aid, which obviously is very much not allowed in the rules. So what I understand what Red Bull, what Racing Point is effectively accusing Renault of is, so obviously during the race you can effectively move your brake bias forward or backwards depending on which brakes you want to use more, and that's all controlled manually by the driver on his steering wheel. Now what people are saying Renault is doing is they are effectively programming these brake bias changes beforehand into the ECU of the car, which then means that obviously depending on the profile of the track, so they'll do it for Suzuka specifically, depending on each corner they will then program what the brake bias will have to be like before they start. So that can be potentially very, very bad for Renault if it does come out that it's the case and that they have been doing this, because I can't see how it won't be a slam dunk disqualification from the race. And then the question should be asked as to whether they've been doing this for a while now, and then their results in all of the previous races are also called into question. So worrying times for Renault, but we'll only hear about, I think, the outcome of the investigation in a couple of days' time. So I'll keep you all posted, and let's see what actually comes out of all of this. Now, let's maybe talk about Racing Point, the accusers. And I think it was an average performance from them. Not much to write home about. I think they did a good job. And interesting, Perez, I think, drove quite well as per usual. I think along with Sainz, and he's been the standout midfield driver, I think, in terms of consistency. Now, quite an interesting thing here actually with Perez, because he crashed out in the last lap of the race. I don't know if you guys saw, but yeah, so during the last lap he collided with Pierre Gasly, and then he crashed out into the second corner. But because of a glitch in the actual timing systems of the race was classified as at the 52nd lap, which was the second to last lap, but not the actual last lap of the race, which meant that Perez hasn't technically crashed yet, which meant that Perez actually maintains his 9th place in the race, which is strange to think about, given that he actually crashed out of the race, but he's still scoring a point. So that's a slight stroke of luck for Perez, if there was such a thing. But I think the other interesting thing to note when thinking about Racing Point is that Stroll out-qualified Perez and got out of Q1, which might explain the terrible weather scene in Japan over the weekend, because that's definitely a rare occurrence, if you can call it, if there was ever one. I think in summary for Racing Point, a solid if unspectacular weekend for the big team. Alright, so Toro Rosso, I think we need to applaud Pierre Gasly. He did an excellent job in the race today. He came home in 8th, if I'm not mistaken, which again is good points for the Toro Rosso team. Daniel Kvyat seemed to struggle a bit more this whole weekend. I to be honest, I didn't really see much of him throughout the whole race or throughout qualifying. So I think he just had one of those anonymous races where drivers just sort of disappear in the ether if there's lots going on elsewhere on the track. And speaking about disappearing in the ether, let's talk about Alfa Romeo, Haas and Williams. And to be honest, all I'm going to say is that these three were the fourth, third and second biggest disasters to hit Japan over the past weekend. And there's not much positives to draw from their performance, to be honest. So I think it's best to leave them alone and hope that for their sake and for their driver's sake, that things go a bit better for them in Mexico. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the TF1 Awards. The Pastor Maldonado Award for Most Underheaded Deed goes to Charles Leclerc and Ferrari for driving around Suzuka in a flurry of carbon fiber sparks. Not only is it dangerous, it compromised Leclerc's own race, Lando Norris's race, and blew pieces of Lewis Hamilton's car into the wilderness. The Lewis Hamilton #Blessed Award has to go to Sebastian Vettel for jumping the start but not getting a further penalty. A few extra millimeters and we'd be singing Ferrari is red, Red Bull is blue, Vettel jumps the start, Mercedes 1-2. The Nico Hülkenberg Podium Award has to go to Lando Norris and Max Verstappen. Both got brilliant starts and was then victims to Leclerc's demolition derby over the first couple of laps. As always, congratulations to the perennial award winners, and what an honor it must be. I think we can all say that it was an intriguing Japanese Grand Prix. Ferrari made me eat my hat in humility, and Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton showed that they are still human and that they cannot operate at 110% every race weekend. We have 2 weeks till Mexico, which leaves us with ample time to answer the most pressing of questions. Will Renault be disqualified for cheating? Will Leclerc finally realize that the ability to grow facial hair is a talent not bestowed on him? Will Sebastian Vettel go on a pole position frenzy? Will it be another 6 months before Valtteri Bottas version 4.0 gets released? As always, much to ponder. And there you go, another episode is at an end. Thanks so much for listening in. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe so that you can never miss another one again. Feel free to argue with me on Twitter or on Instagram. I'm sure there are some of you that disagree with whatever I'm rabbiting on about. So I'll chat to you all again in a week's time. Bye.